Awesome. Thanks so much, Malia, and thanks everybody for coming today. So today we're going to talk about federal requirements as it relates to relocation and acquisition, the URA and Section 104D. So quick agenda here. First, we're going to talk about URA. We're going to talk about both acquisition requirements and relocation requirements. Then we'll talk about Section 104D requirements. And at the end, I have some additional resources that you can utilize if you are undertaking a project that involves acquisition or relocation with federal funds. So the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Policies Act of 1970, and we thank the government officials who shortened that to URA and not Europapa. So it's shortened to URA. One thing to note on URA regulations is that the Department of Transportation is actually the lead federal agency for these regulations. Unlike many other funding sources or other regulations that we work with here at the Division of Housing, which are typically HUD, Department of Transportation set these rules, then HUD works with the Department of Transportation to adopt them for our programs. And so that does mean that sometimes there are additional HUD regulations, funding source specific regulations that are related to relocation and acquisition on top of the base URA regulations. So we'll be talking about those as well. There was also a final rule effective June of last year, 2024, and those regulations, there are some updates to those regulations. When I'm talking about some of these resources that are available on HUD's website, just know that although those resources are still really useful to have and to know about, they are not updated for the final rule requirements as of yet. So just something to keep in mind when you are looking at those references. So the URA, in a sense, it provides protection and assistance to folks who either need to move or have property acquired as a result of federally funded projects. Persons is defined pretty broadly here, so it could be residential, commercial, it could be an owner or a tenant. And it's applicable to all federal funding sources. So that is to say CDBG and its cousins, ESG, home, HTF, etc. So basically any federal funding source that you're getting from the Division of Housing. And it applies to projects that include acquisition, demolition, or rehabilitation. So this is one thing where you're going to need to think about what does the project as a whole consist of. If federal funds are going to new construction alone, that doesn't trigger URA, but if the project as a whole includes acquisition, then URA would be triggered by that URA, by that acquisition, even if the federal funds are going to the new construction only. So just a matter of determining, was this an acquisition that happened with the intent of then applying for federal funds, or is this a situation where there was maybe an acquisition years and years ago, the project literally only consists of new construction, in which case URA would not be triggered. Anytime acquisition, demolition, or rehabilitation is involved, then URA does apply. Sorry. There we go. So as far as acquisition, which we'll talk about first, the questions you're going to want to ask yourself is, was property acquired for this project, or will property be acquired for this project? And if so, then acquisition requirements apply. The term acquisition is also defined fairly broadly in the regs. So your typical acquisition, fee simple transfer, obviously is considered an acquisition. Also considered acquisition includes donations, permanent easements, long-term leases. I think it's over 50 years, if I remember correctly, and acquisitions between two affiliated entities. So if you're doing a tax credit deal, you may have acquisition requirements that apply when there's federal funds. So there's basically two types of acquisition as defined in the regs. There's voluntary acquisition and there's basic or involuntary acquisition. We don't really deal with basic acquisition, so I'm not going to go into that, but we want to just demonstrate that these are voluntary acquisitions. And in order to demonstrate this to HUD, there's two things that need to be documented in writing. One is a statement that the property will not be acquired in the event negotiations fail. And two is an estimated fair market value of the property. For the estimated fair market value, An appraisal is not specifically required by the URA. However, that is generally going to be your easiest way to demonstrate, yep, we looked into this. This is what we believe the fair market value to be. Another note is that our DOH application does often require, or does require, an appraisal when there's when that's included in the budget. So just recommend an appraisal in most cases. There is a sample checklist on our funding application, sample template on our checking application checklist. So you can use that and we'll have all the information you need. Just fill that out, have both the buyer and seller sign that, and that will demonstrate your voluntary acquisition. So that's basically it for acquisition. Any questions so far on acquisition alone, and then we'll get into relocation. Cool, I'll keep going because I got a lot to go through. So for relocation, basically what you're going to think about is, was the site occupied by any residences or businesses in the past 90 days or so prior to a purchase offer or application for federal funds? Again, this is a matter of thinking, what is involved in the project? We don't want to see situations where people are being evicted and then 91 days later applying for federal funds. That's not gonna fly. Just thinking about, you know, was anybody in reality, was anybody moved or relocated for the project? Another definition I want to get on, take care of right off the bat is the initiation of negotiations, or ION. And this is an important date because it serves as a milestone for determining a person's eligibility for relocation assistance, including those moving costs, those relocation replacement housing payments. So the URA has a definition. The URA specifically says this is the definition for ION unless it's superseded by a funding source specific definition. And that's where the HUD rules do come in. And so for home, CDBG, for HDF, for most of our funding sources, the program specific definition is going to be when the agreement for federal funds is executed. So that's your ION date. And when I use that word later, you'll know that that's what that means. So the first thing we're going to want to think about when we are undertaking a project that involves relocation is, let's plan for what is going to happen. Who's occupying the property? Where are they going to go? Are there units available for them to live in the meantime? Who's going to be providing those relocation advisory services? Who's going to coordinate all this work? Depending on the size of your project, it can be a substantial amount of work. So we do often recommend at least thinking about hiring a relocation specialist. This is work that it's not necessarily easy for your property management staff to just take on top of everything else they're doing. So in many cases, we would recommend thinking about a relocation specialist. Home and CDBG do require a written relocation plan, which I'll touch on a little bit more later. We do recommend a written relocation plan for all funding sources, just so you have a clear picture of what's going to go on and what's happening. So when people think about relocation, often the first thing we think about is the notices. So I'll go through those notices. The first notice that is going to be sent out is the GIN, the General Information Notice. This is sent to all tenants. They're notified that there's a potential of being a federally funded project. It's got to come at the time of voluntary acquisition notice to the seller or the application for federal funds, whichever comes first. It should be issued as soon as possible. Just thinking about, if I were in this situation, you were in this situation, you'd probably want to get notified as soon as your funders knew anything. The notice is going to tell them that there's a potential for these federal funds. If the federal funds are awarded, then there'll be relocation assistance. In the meantime, we advise them not to move. Of course, they can always move if they choose to. And it should be always specific to the tenant's situation. So if you've got tenants that you don't expect to be displaced at all, you just need to send out the general information, that's what the notice should say. If you have tenants that are expected to be permanently displaced, that is what the notice should say, just as specific to what the situation is. And that's why your planning is so important right up front. For folks who want to move, so we've got a project, we've applied for federal funds, and let's say we've got a vacant unit and we have a tenant who wants to move in. We want to provide them with a move-in notice before they sign a lease so that they can make an informed decision of whether this is something that they want to move into. And then if they decide they do want to move in and they've agreed to this move-in notice, then they're not eligible for relocation assistance because they've made that informed decision up front before they sign the lease. Then for folks who will be displaced, either temporarily or permanently, we issue a notice of eligibility. So this is where I really want to highlight the new final rule. This is one of the biggest changes in the new final rule, is that the definition of displaced person was broadened to include folks who are moved temporarily. So now almost all of those permanent relocation requirements do apply to folks moving temporarily as well. So that's really important to keep in mind as we go through this presentation. So the notice of eligibility will let them know that they're eligible for compensation. It will estimate the amount of relocation assistance available, the basic conditions of their eligibility, how they're going to obtain that payment. We'll let them know that they have relocation advisory services available to them. For those folks who are moving temporarily, you'll also want to let them know the approximate duration of their temporary relocation. Now, this is also where you're going to include information about comparable replacement dwellings, which I will go into more detail in a few slides. Your next notice for folks being displaced is the 90-day notice. This has to go out at least 90 days before anybody has to move, pretty much what it sounds like. It has to go out after the notice of eligibility is issued. So this may have to move up. The notice of eligibility has to go out on or promptly after the ION, the execution of that federal agreement. So, but you may need to move things up just depending on their construction schedule to make sure that they get the 90-day notice before 90 days prior to when they have to move. The only exception is an emergency situation where maybe there was a disaster or something along those lines. The 90-day notice has to contain the actual date by which the tenant is required to move, or state that they'll receive a further notice with a 30-day notice with a specific date. For folks who are not being displaced at all, who will not have to move, perhaps it's just really minor, they can do the rehab with tenants in place, or maybe it's just exterior work, those folks will get the notice of non-displacement. This notice also goes out to folks who are not eligible for relocation assistance. And this notice must outline the conditions of continued occupancy and advise of their right to appeal should they disagree with the decision. So for all our notices, want to make sure we issue them in a timely manner. Want to make sure we include tenant name and address. Want to make sure that they're specific to the tenant situation. We want to make sure that we verify and document tenant receipt of notices, either with a signature and date or with a return receipt from a certified mail. Another thing I want to point out, as far as the final rule goes, there is mention in the final rule effective last year about electronic delivery and signatures. We have reached out to HUD for additional guidance on this because it looks like we might need HUD approval to do this. We have not yet heard back from HUD as of September 10th, 2025. So if and when we hear more on that, we will definitely let you know. For now, let's stick with the paper signatures. And there's a link at the bottom of the slide to notice templates that are provided by HUD. Any tenant who's not issued a notice in a timely manner and then decides later to move off afterwards are considered to be permanently displaced and are eligible for all permanent relocation assistance. So it's really, really important that we get those notices out to tenants as soon as possible. Just to recap the timeline for these notices. So first step, acquisition or application for federal funds, whichever comes first. That's your trigger point for issuing those GIN notices, the general information notices. After that, after you applied for federal funds, that's when you can start issuing those move-in notices to anybody who wants to move in after the application. At time of initiation of negotiations, that is the time when the agreement is executed, that's when your notice of eligibility or your notice of non-displacement will go out. And then during the project, at least 90 days before anybody has to move, is when your 90-day notice will go out. So That's a lot of notices. Any questions on the notices themselves, or I will go into the rest of the process. Believe it or not, there's more to URA than just the notices. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks very much for all this, Teresa. I was curious about the applicability of the new rule that came out in 2024. Does that apply just to acquisitions that were made after the effective date of that rule?
Oh, that's a great question. I believe so. Yeah, my understanding it was effective June 2024. I forget the exact date. So anything that happens after that would be my understanding that would apply.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, go ahead, whoever. Sorry, I'm not seeing who's raising their hands. So.
Teresa, it's okay. It was Jennifer put in the chat, just the date was June 3rd, 2024.
Thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate you.
But I believe that is all the questions as of right now.
Cool. Okay, so in addition to everything else, the first thing we're going to want to think about, in addition to all the planning and work we're doing, we're also going to want to think about how can we minimize displacement. Obviously, eliminating displacement altogether isn't always possible, but if you've got two situations where maybe there's a different property you could acquire that would displace fewer people, or maybe you've got a multi-building project that you can move folks around within the project and have fewer people permanently displaced, that's something that should be one of your considerations when you're planning your project. Obviously, as mentioned before, don't refuse to renew a lease, don't evict folks for the purposes to evade relocation assistance responsibility. Advisory services are required for all tenants who are affected, so that includes a personal interview with anybody who's affected, just to make sure that they know, the timeline, the procedure, if they have any needs or preferences that need to be taken into consideration while you're doing your relocation. Important to get those on the table so that everybody's on the same page. There's also a requirement that folks who identify as minority persons must be given a reasonable opportunity to move to an area of non-minority concentration. It's always going to be their decision if they want to move out of the neighborhood or not, but they need to be given that opportunity.
Teresa, we did get one question in the chat. It was just asking if there were some examples of tenants not being eligible for funding resources.
I have a slide in a few that talks about non-eligible folks.
Great.
So for your comparable replacement dwellings, obviously you're moving people off-site, you're going to need to move them somewhere. And those dwellings that you move your tenants to need to be comparable replacement dwellings. There need to be at least 3 comparable replacements offered. Those need to be decent, safe, and sanitary. They need to be inspected prior to offer to ensure that they're decent, safe, and sanitary. Decent, safe, and sanitary is defined in the regs. There's a couple of things, pretty straightforward, common sense things. It also specifically says that the decent, safe, and sanitary units must also meet the most stringent of local housing code, federal regulations, etc. So whatever your most strict decent, safe, and sanitary regulations are, you're going to want to comply with those. In general, it's got to be functionally equivalent to the displacement dwelling. So typically that's going to be same number of rooms, more or less, same amenities, stuff like that. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but functionally equivalent, equal or better. The regs also specify the replacement dwelling can't be subject to adverse environmental conditions. It's got to be in a location that's generally not less desirable than the location of the displacement unit, and in a site that's generally recognized to be residential, typical of a residential site for those residential moves. We also will have business moves, obviously. It's a different situation. The occupant, that tenant, can choose any of the 3 options, comparable replacement dwelling options that were offered to them, or they can go out and do their own research. And maybe they want to move into a different neighborhood. And as long as you've offered them at least 3, then they can go make their decision. There's specific rules as it applies to relocation from subsidized units. One thing is that Comparables are based on the HUD unit size requirements rather than the previously occupied dwelling, in case you have somebody in a subsidized unit who's in a unit that's not quite the right size per HUD regulations. And there's also rules on whether the replacement dwelling can be a subsidized unit based on where the folks are being displaced from. So I'm going to walk through this chart one by one because it's not digitally accessible and because I want to make sure you all understand. So if you've got somebody in a public housing unit, you're displacing these folks from the public housing unit. They may be displaced, they may be offered as a comparable replacement dwelling, another public housing unit, or another unit with some sort of project or tenant-based subsidy, or they may be offered as a comparable replacement dwelling, a unit on the private market. If you are displacing somebody from a private unit with a project-based subsidy, you may relocate them to another unit with a project-based subsidy or a tenant-based subsidy, or may offer them somewhere on the private market, but you may not relocate them to a public housing unit. That would not be considered comparable. For somebody with in a private unit with a tenant-based subsidy being displaced, they may be moved to another unit that's privately owned with a tenant-based subsidy, or they may move to a unit on the private market, but they may not be moved to a public housing unit, nor to a privately owned unit with a project-based subsidy, as those would not be considered comparable. And finally, if you're moving somebody from a unit that's on the private market, they may only be offered another unit on the private market. A subsidized unit would not be considered comparable. As far as replacement housing payments go, and so we're basically going to take the existing rent amount and the new rent amount, including utility allowances, calculate that difference, assuming the new housing payment is more. We're going to pay that difference for 42 months. That's under URA. When I get to section 104D, 104D requires payment for 60 months. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in another slide. The one caveat is that for folks who are earning below 80% AMI, if they're currently paying more than 30% of their income, they may not pay more than 30% of their income at the replacement dwelling. So you may need to increase that replacement housing payment so that at the replacement dwelling, they're not paying more than 30% of their income. One nice thing as far as the regs go on this is calculated once at time of ION and does not need to be recalculated even if rents change, if income has changed. So at least from a paperwork point of view, that's one nice thing about the URA. There is also an option to establish an upper limit for replacement housing payment. And the way you do this is you will offer them those 3 comparable replacement dwellings. You'll put that in the notice of eligibility. You will have inspected those units to make sure they're decent, safe, and sanitary. You're going to make sure that receipt of that notice is documented. And you're going to say, we found these 3 replacement dwellings. They're all within, X dollar amount. And so that's where we're going to cap our replacement housing payment. There is, in the statute, there's a dollar monetary limit. However, I will just go to my next slide. There's a provision for housing of last resort, which requires you to exceed that statutory cap if housing cannot be found that are within those limits. So I'm not even going to tell you what the dollar amount is because I don't know, because you're going to have to exceed that if you can't meet that. So as far as housing of last resort goes, if the displaced person is not satisfied with any of the 3 options that have been offered to them, they can go out and do their own research and choose a place of their own. That's fine. If they're happy, we're happy. As long as that replacement dwelling is also decent, safe, and sanitary. Having the tenant relocate to a place that is decent, safe, and sanitary, that's a hard line that must happen. And as I said, if in your area, in the area that the project is in, there doesn't exist decent, safe, sanitary units available within those monetary limits, you still have to make sure, either by exceeding the statutory cap or by building or renovating to create new units, to make sure those folks are housed somewhere that is decent, safe, and sanitary. So that's a requirement. In addition to your replacement housing cost, you're going to have moving costs. So the cost of moving the tenant from their displacement dwelling to their replacement dwelling, that needs to be covered. That can be done by a commercial move or self-move. Generally, the displaced person gets to choose whether that self-move is going to be based on actual reasonable expenses, a moving cost estimate from a third party, or a fixed payment schedule. Related expenses are also covered under the URA, including packing, maybe if there's any storage needed, anything like that. The final rule, 2024 final rule, added non-refundable application and credit check fees specifically as being covered under the URA. So if your tenant is applying for housing at another development that requires an application or credit check fee, those will be covered under URA, must be paid. There's no maximum cap on moving costs as long as they are reasonable. If and when you're relocating a business, there's some additional reasonable related expenses that would apply. We don't see that very often. Reach out if you have any questions about that, but things like costs associated with uninstalling and reinstalling equipment, stuff like that is going to be more common with your business relocation. So I mentioned the temporary displacement and how the final rule now treats temporary displacement much more similarly to your permanent displacement. So the main differences are going to be moving costs. Obviously, for a temporary relocation, you're going to need to pay the moving costs both out and back in again. And the rental assistance would only be paid during the period of time that they're relocated, not the full 42 or 60 months. If the temporary displacement ends up lasting more than 1 year, it's no longer considered temporary, it becomes permanent, and then you're on the hook for those full 42 or 60 months. And the tenant must have a guarantee of returning to the same building or complex in order to be considered temporary relocation. Here's our slide on folks that are not eligible for relocation assistance. So evictions for cause. Make sure you get that documentation. Make sure that the eviction really was for cause, and that's well documented. Voluntary move out. Somebody, if they want to move, that's their life. They are always welcome to do so. When they move out, you're really going to want to make sure, first of all, that they have already received any applicable notices to that point, and second of all, that they sign something acknowledging that they are moving out voluntarily and giving up any relocation assistance. Folks that are not lawfully occupying the space, like if you've got maybe you've got a vacant warehouse and somebody's just sheltering there, that would not be you would not be required to give them relocation assistance. Same thing for folks not lawfully present in the United States. You are not required to give federal relocation assistance to those folks. The owner-occupant who voluntarily sells, so if you've entered into that voluntary acquisition negotiation, you've agreed on a price that is fair, it seems fair to both of you, that owner-occupant has received the payment for their property. They're not eligible for additional relocation assistance on top of that sales price, which you've already given them. And temporary, daily, or emergency shelter occupants are also not eligible. Since I know we had somebody who had a question on the non-eligible folks, I want to pause for just a minute and see if there was any additional questions on that. Cool. I'll keep going, and if something comes up, feel free to stop me. So record keeping, as with anything federally funded, state funded, if it's not in writing, it did not happen. There is the HUD Handbook 1378, which specifies how relocation is going to require HUD requirements for relocation. They have a whole chapter on record keeping requirements. This is not an exclusive list or exhaustive list, but do make sure that anything you do keep records of that, keep it in writing. We at DOH are typically requesting monthly updates as we go along through the project, just because it's going to be a lot easier to correct something if it's caught immediately versus waiting 2 years and then realizing that somebody moved out 2 years ago and now we've got to go find them. So we're requesting record keeping monthly. Then you'll also need to keep those records for at least 3 years per the URA, although HUD requires 4 years for CDBG or 5 years for home or HTF. So check your regs to see how long those records need to be kept. And that's keeping those records from the final payment that's made. So if you're relocating somebody, they're permanent relocated, let's say you pay them for 60 months per 104D, it's gonna be 5 years after that final payment. And unfortunately, we have to talk about what happens if URA is not complied with. There are several corrective actions that are specified in the regulations. Always, we want to make sure that we're complying with the URA correctly the first time around, so that we don't have to go into these corrective actions, but here they are. First of all, if you've got any tenants that you failed to provide notices to, you will need to initiate all reasonable procedures to locate all former occupants. That's a quote from the regs. And reasonable procedures is also defined quite broadly. It includes posting in a newspaper, reaching out to family and friends, reaching out to community organizations, reaching out to places of employment, hiring a pirate investigator. So really important to get those notices out, because we do not want to spend time tracking people down to get them on notice years after the fact. That's not going to be fun for everybody or anybody. Underpayment, same thing. If it turns out that somebody was underpaid, you must ensure that they receive proper payment and receive it promptly. If you determine that somebody was relocated to replacement housing that is not decent, safe, and sanitary, they must be given the option to move to a unit that is decent, safe, and sanitary, or the unit that they're living in must be repaired so that it is decent, safe, and sanitary. Again, that's a really strong, hard rule on making sure folks are relocated to somewhere decent, safe, and sanitary. And for those folks who are minority, identify as minority persons, if they were not given the opportunity to relocate to an area of non-minority concentration, they must be given that opportunity. It's again, their choice is whether to accept or not. So any person that's, somehow negatively affected, if URA was not complied with, those folks are considered to be permanently displaced. All permanent relocation assistance must be given to them. If the displacing agency does not correctly comply with URA, there's no statute of limitations. So somebody can come back years later and say, oh, I moved out, blah, 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 blah. So again, I just can't stress this enough, that work with us. We can help you comply with URA correctly the first time around, and then we won't have to do any corrective actions. Of course, in the worst case scenario, HUD always reserves the right to apply sanctions, including recovery or termination of funding. And nobody wants that. So then I will dive into section 104D. I just have a couple slides on this, so I think I'll just go through these and then I'll pause for questions at the end. So section 104D, this is going to be a subset of projects that trigger URA. So it's triggered only by home and CDBG, and it's triggered only by demolition of housing. Anything that any project that section 104D applies to, we know that URA also applies, but if URA is triggered, section 104D may or may not be triggered. So section 104D is just a couple additional requirements on top of the URA. So the first one is that written residential anti-displacement and relocation assistance plan. As I talked about, that written plan, we really, really recommend it across all funding sources. Section 104D is the one that requires a written relocation plan. There's also a requirement to replace all lower income dwelling units. Since here at the Division of Housing, Office of Finance and Sustainability, We are typically funding the development, creation of housing units. So this is not typically something that's an issue for us, but just keep in mind that if you are demolishing any housing units in order to build new housing units, make sure you're replacing them on a 1-for-1 basis. That includes thinking about bedroom size. So if you're demolishing, let's say, a 40-unit apartment building that's all 3-bedroom units, we should have at least 40 3-bedroom units in whatever is built after the fact. A studio would not count as a replacement dwelling for that 3-bedroom unit that was demolished. And there's some additional relocation assistance for lower income residential tenants. And I've got a chart here comparing the two. So Section 104D applies to lower income, that is 80% AMI or below, residential tenants only, no commercial tenants. The relocation assistance is paid out for 60 months rather than the 42 months. You are allowed to offer vouchers as part of your replacement housing payment under Section 104D, whereas we talked about that's not allowed under URA unless the person being displaced is coming from a unit with a voucher. And as we said, URA applies to all federal funds, whereas Section 104D applies to home and CDBG only. In general, the tenant has the option to choose between the URA or the Section 104D calculations. There's a HUD comparison sheet there that goes into a little bit more detail. I think the other thing that sometimes we run into is that 104D covers refundable security deposits, whereas the URA only covers those non-refundable application fees and stuff like that. So if you want to dive in a little bit more, I recommend checking out that HUD comparison sheet. So here we have the HUD Handbook 1378, which I talked about, a really good resource, really outlines some of the requirements in clear language. It is not updated for the final rule. The HUD the URA training is a great, I think it's a 10-part webinar series. Again, really great resource. Take it with a grain of salt, especially if you're watching the temporary relocation one, because that has not been updated for the final rule. And then your 49 CFR Part 24, that's your URA regulations, and your 24 CFR Part 42, that's your Section 104D regulations. All right, I've made it, and I will navigate to where I can see some questions.
Thanks, Teresa. Yeah, we did have a question in the chat. Are you able to see that?
Yeah, so it's asking, excuse me, 104D only if home or CDBG is at the housing that's going to be demolished or if new housing is going to use those funds. So if the project includes demolition of housing units with home or CDBG funds, that's when the 104D would be triggered. So if the project includes demolition, even if the funding is going to new construction, the project including demolition would trigger the 104D.
Great. Any other questions for Teresa or anything?
And feel free to reach out to either me or your development specialist or your asset manager if you have further questions that are project specific. And I'll let you respond to that, Malia.
Yes, so I was going to touch on that. Thank you. Yes, we will be posting the slides and the recording of this training to our website. I'm going to put the link here in the chat where you can find those. But yes, yeah, feel free to reach out to if you have any issues with getting a copy of those slides. But I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. If you do have any questions that you want to ask, maybe not in front of the larger group, some staff will stay on and we can answer those at the end.